Morning fog blanketed Cedar Mill, where Tony lived with his daughter Rosa and their German shepherd Bentley in an old farmhouse. What seemed like a peaceful day suddenly shifted when Rosa knelt in the garden, trembling hands, lifting soil to her lips, while Bentley unearthed a crumpled wrapper dusted with white powder beneath the roses. In the father's anxious gaze and the child's desperate breaths, Bentley's discovery opened a secret that would shake the entire town. Watch the full story today. Morning settled over Cedar Mill with a veil of pale fog. It rolled through the low hills and drifted across the old fences that lined the fields. From a distance, the town seemed asleep, barns half hidden in the haze rooftops, blurred as though painted in water. The air smelled of damp earth and honeysuckle, a mixture both sweet and heavy. And the only sound was the faint groan of a weathered windmill turning at the edge of the valley. Tony Cole stood on the porch of his farmhouse. The house had belonged to his family for 3 generations. Its paint was faded, its steps worn smooth by years of boots, yet it stood firm, as plain and dependable as the man himself. Tony was in his late 30s, tall and steady in frame shoulders shaped by long patrols and hours of labor on the land. His face carried lines of both service and loss. Since the passing of his wife, silence often filled the corners of the house. That silence was softened only by the presence of his daughter Rosa, and by Bentley the German shepherd, who rarely left their side. Rosa was 8 years old, small and bright-eyed. Her chestnut hair caught the morning light like strands of copper. She was gentle by nature, thoughtful, and carried a quiet strength unusual for her age. She had inherited her mother's love for flowers and spent long hours in the garden whispering to the roses as though they could listen. Bentley was 6, a sable-coated German shepherd with a strong frame and amber eyes. His left ear bent slightly from an old mishap, giving him a look both alert and endearing. Once trained as a service dog, he had retired into the role of loyal companion. He had guarded Tony during his years on the force and had since turned his attention to Rosa, shadowing her steps with calm devotion. On that morning, Bentley padded across the porch beside Tony, pausing to lift his head into the breeze. His body was relaxed, yet his gaze followed every shift in the fog. Rosa was somewhere in the yard, though the mist made it hard to see. Tony lifted a cup of black coffee, its warmth steadying his hands. He looked across the field, noting how the fog seemed thicker than usual, clinging low over the grass. It gave the land an eerie stillness. The town of Cedar Mill often felt timeless, but today something pressed against his chest, a weight he could not explain. The rhythm of their mornings was simple. Rosa would wander to the garden, Bentley trailing at her heels, while Tony planned the day. Yet the quiet carried a strange edge. The roses just budding with the new season seemed muted in the pale light. Even the sound of birds was thin, as if the mist had swallowed their voices. Tony thought about his daughter's resilience. She had known loss too young, yet she smiled when the daisies bloomed or when Bentley nudged her hand. He had promised himself he would guard that smile whatever it took. The town trusted him as an officer, but within his own home, he carried a deeper role, father and protector. A faint sound stirred the silence, distant yet distinct. It was not the hum of the windmill, nor the call of a bird. It was the soft scrape of soil being disturbed, followed by the uneven rhythm of small hands pressing against earth. Tony's brow furrowed. The sound came from the garden where Rosa often played. Bentley's ears shot forward, his muscles tensed, though his tail stayed low. He turned his head sharply, nose testing the air. Then, without waiting, he stepped off the porch, paws pressing into the damp grass, moving toward the flower beds. Tony set down his cup, unease rising in his chest. He followed Bentley into the fog, each step bringing the sound closer, sharper. The scrape of dirt, the hush of quick breaths, the faint rustle of clothing against wet leaves. The garden loomed ahead, roses dark against the pale mist. And there near the trellis, a small figure knelt in the soil. Tony froze. His pulse quickened. He opened his mouth to call her name. The mist parted just enough for Tony to see clearly. Rosa was on her knees in the flower bed, her small hands coated in dark earth. She lifted a fistful of soil to her mouth and pressed it in with a desperate urgency that made Tony's stomach clench. "Rosa," he called, his voice rough, caught between command and fear. She looked up, her cheeks streaked with dirt, her lips stained dark. Her wide gray-blue eyes shimmered with tears. For a moment she froze, caught in shame and confusion. Then her shoulders shook. She whispered in a trembling voice, "I cannot stop Dad. I need it." Tony knelt quickly, pulling her hands gently away from the ground. The soil crumbled from her fingers, damp and cold. He cupped her wrists, steady but tender, trying to anchor her in his arms. His throat tightened as he searched for words. "Rosa, this is not right. Tell me what is happening." Her voice broke again, fragile as the mist around them. "It started after Kylie gave me the new vitamins. The white-capped ones. When I take them, I feel like my body begs for the dirt. Like it is the only thing that helps." Tony's breath caught. His chest filled with dread that pressed against his ribs. Kylie had insisted those supplements were safe, yet here was his daughter trembling, craving soil as though poisoned. Bentley lowered his muzzle to the disturbed bed, sniffing hard. He pawed, once scattering clumps of dirt, then froze. His nose pressed into the ground again. With a sharp motion, he dug and pushed aside a layer of soil. A crumpled wrapper came into view, pale and streaked with powder. Tony reached for it with cautious fingers. The paper stuck together with dampness, its folds holding flecks of a white substance. He lifted it, the smell faintly chemical, far from the scent of the garden. His gut twisted. Behind him, Rosa whimpered softly. He drew her close, wiping her lips with his sleeve. The taste of earth clung to her skin, bitter and raw. He whispered into her hair, words as much for himself as for her. "It will be all right, Rosa. I will find out what this means." Bentley gave a low huff, circling the bed, his paws stirring the soil as if unwilling to let the hidden truth go. His amber eyes locked on Tony, waiting watchful. Tony stood holding both the wrapper and his daughter. The mist still clung to the garden, thicker now, wrapping the trellis in gray. The roses swayed slightly, their blooms muted in the dim light, as though the garden itself mourned. He carried Rosa back toward the porch. She leaned against his chest, exhausted, her small frame shaking. Bentley trotted beside them, ears flicking back toward the flower bed, unwilling to turn fully away. Inside the house, Tony sat Rosa down on the couch and wrapped her in a blanket. He placed the wrapper on the table, its edges curling like a silent warning. His mind spun. Kylie had spoken of vitamins and reassurance, yet something about them gnawed at his instincts. The morning that had begun with quiet fog now felt like the opening of a storm. His daughter was at the center, caught in a web of craving and fear. Bentley had unearthed the first piece of the truth, and Tony knew there would be more to find. He pressed a hand to his daughter's head, then turned his gaze to the small bottle of pills sitting on the kitchen shelf, its cap a bright white against the dim room. Tony rose from the couch and crossed to the kitchen shelf. The bottle of pills stood there, in plain sight, small and unremarkable at first glance. Yet the white cap caught his eye, clean and glossy, as if it had been placed only yesterday. He lifted it slowly, weighing the little container in his hand. The label was fresh, the paper slightly glossy. He rubbed a thumb across the surface and felt the edges peel, as if it had been pressed on without care. The print was uneven, the letters faintly blurred. His time in the police force had trained him to notice details, and every line of the label spoke of haste and disguise rather than trust. He twisted the cap and shook one tablet into his palm. The pill was chalky, leaving dust against his skin. He raised it to his nose. The scent was faintly chemical, sharp and unnatural. He remembered the smell of his wife's herbal teas, the soft aroma of mint and chamomile that once drifted through the kitchen. This scent was the opposite, flat and bitter, a trace of something hidden. Behind him, Rosa shifted under her blanket, her small face pale and damp with sweat. Bentley moved to her side, resting his head on the couch, his amber eyes never leaving her. Then the shepherd turned his nose toward the open window. He sniffed, ears pricked, and with sudden purpose, he padded across the room and slipped out the door. Tony followed quickly, bottle still in his hand. The fog had thinned, but the air remained heavy with dampness. Bentley moved through the yard with precision, his nose low, tail stiff. He reached the old well near the edge of the property. Its stone's moss covered the wooden cover, tilted with age. Bentley pawed at the ground, then lowered his muzzle. When he lifted his head, something small clung between his teeth. He trotted back and dropped it at Tony's boots. It was another tablet, half dissolved, streaked with dirt. The powder stuck in clumps to the damp grass. Tony crouched, lifting it carefully. The surface was crumbly, far more fragile than any supplement he had ever seen. He held the soggy pill next to the dry one in his hand. They were the same size, the same dull color, yet both carried that same unsettling scent. His chest tightened as the truth pressed harder against him. This was not medicine. This was something meant to shape his daughter's body and mind, something that had already taken hold of her cravings. Bentley whined softly, nudging Tony's hand as if urging him to act. The dog's presence steadied him. He placed both tablets into a small jar and set the bottle beside it on the counter inside. On the table, the wrapper lay curled powder, clinging like snow that refused to melt. Tony looked at Rosa. She had drifted into a shallow sleep, the blanket pulled to her chin. Her breathing was uneven, but her small hands clutched the silver locket she wore, a gift from her late mother. Tony sat at the table and opened a notebook. He drew a careful line at the top of the page and began to write. Day 1. Rosa ate soil after taking white-capped pills. Wrapper found in garden. 1 tablet recovered from near the well. The label appears altered. Odor chemicals. To be documented further. His pen scratched the paper with deliberate strokes. The act of recording steadied his thoughts. He would not let this slip into rumor or doubt. He would gather facts page by page. As he closed the notebook, a faint sound stirred at the doorway. The floor creaked under light steps, and a soft voice carried into the room. "Tony, you are up early," Kylie said. Bentley's ears shot up. The shepherd moved closer to Rosa, his gaze fixed sharply on the figure at the door. Kylie stood framed in the doorway, a faint smile on her lips. Morning light caught the silk robe she wore, its pale fabric soft against the wooden frame of the house. Her auburn hair fell over her shoulders in smooth waves, her green eyes carrying a look that hovered between warmth and calculation. "You should not worry so much," she said, her tone light. "The supplements are harmless. They are just vitamins. Dr. Pike recommended them for Rosa. Children need a little help sometimes, especially after a change in routine." Tony turned his gaze back to the notebook resting on the table. His hand covered the page, shielding the words he had just written. He did not answer her at once. His eyes drifted to Rosa on the couch, her small body curled, under the blanket, breath shallow but steady. The thought of her eating soil in desperation pressed against him like a weight he could not shake. Bentley shifted closer to Rosa, his broad frame planted firmly between her and Kylie. His ears were high, his muscles taut under his sable coat. He gave a single low huff, not aggressive, but a sound of warning. His amber eyes stayed locked on Kylie, reading her every move. Kylie's smile wavered. She stepped into the kitchen, her silk robe brushing against the counter as she reached for a glass. "You are tired, Tony. You see shadows where there are none. Vitamins crumble, labels change, bottles get replaced. These things happen." She lifted the glass to her lips, sipping slowly. "Do not let your grief make you imagine danger." Her words floated through the air with practiced calm, but Tony felt the edges of them press against him like needles. He wanted to challenge her, to demand answers about the fresh label, about the pill Bentley had pulled from the dirt. Yet he remained still silent, his jaw tight. He had learned long ago that silence sometimes carried more strength than accusation. He glanced once more at his daughter. Rosa stirred, clutching the silver locket tighter against her chest. The sight steadied him. He picked up his pen again, drew a new line beneath the first entry, and wrote slowly. Day 1 continued. Kylie explains pills are vitamins. Observation words rehearsed avoidance in tone. Bentley, alert, protective, positioned near Rosa at all times. The scratching of his pen filled the room. Kylie's eyes flicked toward the notebook, but Tony closed it with deliberate care and set it beside the jar containing the tablets. Bentley growled low in his chest, a steady vibration that spoke of unease. He lowered his head near Rosa's shoulder, his stance protective, his gaze never breaking from Kylie. The shepherd had served long years in patrols and searches, trained to notice what others missed. His instincts were speaking, and Tony had learned to trust them as much as he trusted his own. Kylie placed the empty glass on the counter and turned toward the hall. Her smile returned faint but strained. You should rest. I will check on Rosa later. With that, she drifted from the kitchen, the sound of her steps fading into the quiet of the house. Tony exhaled slowly, his shoulders heavy with the weight of questions left unasked. The morning light had grown stronger, but inside the house the air felt thicker, filled with tension and silence. He opened the notebook once more and underlined his notes. Bentley lifted his head ears, twitching toward the ceiling. He gave a short bark, sharp and sudden, directed upward, as though something hidden lingered above. Tony followed the dog's gaze. The attic hatch sat closed, dust marking its edges. A place seldom visited, yet holding the weight of years. The bark lingered in the air, sharp against the morning quiet. Tony's gaze stayed on the attic hatch above its wooden edges marked by years of dust. He had avoided that space since his wife's passing. The thought of opening it had felt like stirring ghosts. But Bentley's steady stare told him the time for hesitation was gone. He pulled the ladder from the hallway and set it beneath the hatch. The boards creaked as he climbed each step, echoing louder than it should. Bentley settled at the bottom tail, sweeping, once eyes fixed upward, as if keeping watch. The hatch gave a low groan as Tony pushed it open. Dust drifted down, catching in the beam of light. He hauled himself into the attic, the air stale and heavy, carrying the scent of cedar and mothballs. Shadows stretched across the beams, broken only by the thin glow from his flashlight. Boxes lined the walls, trunks stacked in corners, relics of the family's long years in the house. Tony moved carefully, brushing aside cobwebs. His hand paused on a cedar chest, its brass corners tarnished, but still solid. He knelt, feeling the cool grain under his fingers, and lifted the lid. Inside lay folded quilts, a cracked photo frame, and beneath them a bundle of letters bound with twine. The paper had yellowed with age, the script neat and familiar. His breath caught when he recognized the handwriting. Teresa Quinn, Rosa's grandmother. He untied the twine, the letters brittle but clear. One envelope rested on top, its seal broken long ago. He unfolded the page, eyes tracing the words that seemed to reach across years. If Rosa ever shows cravings for soil, do not dismiss it. Do not let soothing voices convince you it is nothing. Trust your own eyes. Trust your heart. Beware of medicines that arrive with sudden change. Family safety rests in your vigilance. Tony read the line again, the weight of it pressing into him. Teresa had been strict, often sharp in her manner. Yet her instincts had always been fierce. She had warned him, without knowing she was writing for this very day. He set the letter aside and dug deeper. At the bottom of the chest was a padded envelope. He opened it to reveal a printed invoice, its ink still clear. His jaw tightened as he read the details: mineral supplements, white cap bottles shipped directly to their address. The account name was printed in bold. Kylie Hale. The date matched the week Rosa's cravings had begun. The attic seemed to tighten around him. The old beams creaked and the air pressed heavy on his chest. His hand shook as he copied the details into his notebook, each line darker than the last. Pills ordered online, Kylie's name shipment aligned with Rosa's decline. He closed the envelope and slid it into his jacket pocket. His flashlight beam passed once more over the old quilts and photographs. Memories of his wife's laughter stirred, colliding with the cold reality of the page in his hand. Grief and resolve twisted together until his throat ached. Bentley barked again from below, a short call that pulled Tony back. He climbed down the ladder, dust trailing from his sleeves. The shepherd stood at attention, ears high, eyes questioning. Tony crouched to scratch his fur. "You were right, boy." The truth was up there. He stepped back into the kitchen, the notebook pressed close to his chest. Rosa stirred on the couch, murmuring in her sleep, clutching her locket tight. Tony brushed her hair from her face and sat beside her, the letter's warning echoing in his mind. The storm he feared was no longer just a feeling. It was written in ink, sealed in proof, and carried in the fragile body of his daughter. As evening light began to fade, Rosa opened her eyes and whispered, "Dad." Her voice was thin, her gaze lost in shadows. Tony leaned closer, his hand steady on hers. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken ache. The next morning unfolded in silence. The fog had lifted from Cedar Mill, yet inside the farmhouse, a weight lingered. Rosa sat by the window, knees drawn to her chest, the silver locket resting in her palm. She traced its surface with her thumb, as if the cool metal could bring her mother's voice back to her. Tony watched from the doorway, his heart tight. Rosa had been so young when her mother passed, yet her absence seemed to grow heavier with each year. The girl carried memories like fragile treasures, clutched tighter than any toy. At times, she seemed older than her age, her eyes searching for someone who could no longer answer. The garden had once been a place of laughter. Tony remembered his wife kneeling among the roses, guiding Rosa's small hands as she planted daisies. Now Rosa walked those same beds alone, her steps slow, her expression distant. She whispered to the flowers as if they might still hold her mother's secrets. Bentley followed her everywhere. The shepherd's paws pressed soft patterns in the soil, his body never more than a breath away. When Rosa knelt to touch the earth, Bentley lowered himself beside her, his head resting near her hand. He seemed to understand that silence was not empty, but filled with all the words Rosa could not speak. One afternoon, Tony found Rosa sitting on the porch steps, the locket pressed against her lips. Her chestnut hair fell over her face, and tears shimmered without falling. Bentley eased closer, nudging her shoulder with his nose. Rosa leaned against him, burying her face into his coat. The dog did not move, his amber eyes steady, his presence a wall of quiet strength. Tony approached slowly, lowering himself onto the step beside them. He wanted to tell her it would get easier, that the ache would fade with time, yet the words felt thin. Instead, he placed an arm around her and let the moment pass in stillness. The three of them, father, daughter, and dog, sat as the sun slid lower, the fields painted in gold. Later, Rosa returned to the garden, her small hands brushing the leaves of the daisies. "Mom always said they were brave flowers," she whispered. Tony heard her voice tremble, but kept his distance, giving her space to speak into the air. Bentley stretched beside the trellis, eyes half closed, but his ears turned toward her every word. The locket glinted as Rosa lifted it once more. Inside was a photograph, her mother smiling, holding Rosa as a toddler. Rosa kissed the image lightly before tucking it back against her chest. Tony wrote in his notebook that evening. Day 2. Rosa withdrawn. Spends hours in the garden with the locket. Mood fragile. Bentley, constant companion. Shows protective behavior. The notes were his armor, a record to steady the swirl of grief and suspicion. As night settled, Rosa lay curled on the couch again. Bentley placed himself on the rug before her. His body stretched long, his head resting between his paws. Tony watched the steady rise and fall of both their breathing. For a moment he allowed himself to believe the shepherd was more than a dog. He was a guardian sent to carry what Tony could not. Yet the ache in Rosa's eyes lingered. The craving for soil, the sudden frailty, the shadow of Kylie's pills. They pressed against Tony's chest like the weight of an oncoming storm. He knew he needed answers beyond his own watchful notes. Someone had to give him clarity, someone who could name what was happening to his daughter. The next morning, Tony decided to take Rosa into town. The local doctor had known their family for years. If anyone could explain the strange symptoms, it would be him. Bentley trotted ahead as they stepped onto the porch, but when Tony glanced down, he saw Rosa's face pale, her eyes hollow with fatigue. The locket gleamed against her chest, the last anchor to the mother she missed. Tony tightened his grip on the notebook under his arm. He was ready to listen, ready to press for truth. The drive into town was quiet. Rosa leaned against the window, her face pale. Her small hands wrapped around the locket that hung at her chest. Bentley sat upright in the back seat, his gaze fixed out the window, his ears flicking at every passing sound. Tony kept one hand firm on the wheel, the other resting on the notebook balanced beside him. Each page felt heavier with every word he had added. The clinic sat at the corner of Main Street, its white paint peeling the sign above the door, faded with years of sun. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and dust. Dr. Harold Pike greeted them with a polite smile. He was a man in his 40s, lean, his hair thinning at the crown, his eyes lined with fatigue. He had delivered Rosa years ago, back when Tony's wife was alive. That memory should have made this meeting easier. Instead, Tony felt the weight of suspicion pressing harder. Pike knelt beside Rosa, his voice gentle. "How have you been, young?" Rosa's answer was a quiet shrug. Her eyes lowering to the floor, she shifted closer to Bentley, who stood close by his tail, brushing her arm. Tony explained what he had seen in the garden, his voice steady but firm. "She has been eating soil. It started after Kylie gave her the new pills. She trembles when she takes them. I need to know why." The doctor pressed his lips together, listening, then nodded slowly. He took Rosa's hand, checked her pulse, and peered into her eyes with a small flashlight. He examined her mouth, her breathing, her heart. After a few minutes, he leaned back with a sigh. "It is unusual," he admitted. "But children sometimes go through phases. Some crave odd things when they feel anxious or when their bodies lack minerals. I would not be alarmed yet." Tony's jaw tightened. He opened his notebook, his pen scratching across the page. Day 3. Dr. Pike visit. Symptoms dismissed. Diagnosis child phase. No tests ordered. The word steadied his anger, but did not ease it. He looked back at the doctor. "She is pale, weak, restless. Her cravings are not harmless. This is not just a phase." Pike shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his glasses. "Keep her hydrated. Give her rest. If it continues, we can revisit the matter. For now, I would not overreact." Bentley's ears shot up at the sound of the pill bottle being placed on the table. Pike had taken it to inspect the label. As his fingers turned the container, Bentley stiffened. A low growl rumbled from his chest. His hackles rose, his stance firm between Rosa and the doctor. "Easy, boy," Tony murmured, placing a hand on the shepherd's back. But Bentley did not relax. His amber eyes locked on the bottle, his teeth showing just enough to make Pike set the container down quickly. The doctor forced a smile, masking unease. "See, even he senses your worry. Let's not let fear build where it does not need to." Tony closed his notebook with a snap. He slid the bottle back toward him, his hand covering it. "Fear does not write invoices," he said under his breath. Pike pretended not to hear. They left the clinic with Rosa leaning against Bentley, the shepherd's body, steady beneath her small hand. Tony walked beside them, the notebook heavy in his grip. He had wanted clarity, but the visit had left him with only more doubt. As they stepped into the daylight, Tony knew he needed someone else. Someone who would not look away. Someone who dealt in facts, not excuses. His thoughts turned to Parker Mendel, a private investigator he had once trusted with a difficult case. Parker was blunt, thorough, and loyal to the truth. Tony set his jaw, guiding Rosa toward the truck. Bentley jumped in first, his body tense but alert, as though ready for the next step. The road home passed in silence. Rosa dozed in the back seat, her head against Bentley's flank. The shepherd sat tall beside her, his chest rising steady, his ears flicking at each turn of the wheels. Tony glanced at the rearview mirror more than the road his jaw set. The doctor's dismissal replayed in his mind like an echo he could not silence. That evening, after Rosa had fallen asleep with Bentley curled at her side, Tony stepped onto the porch and dialed a number he had kept tucked away. Parker Mendel answered on the second ring, his voice gravelly but sharp. "Tony Cole." "Been a while. I need your help," Tony said, his tone flat. "This is about Rosa. Something is poisoning her, and I need proof, real proof. No more excuses." There was a pause, then Parker replied, "I'll be there at dawn." True to his word, Parker's car pulled into the gravel drive the next morning. He stepped out, a sturdy man in his 50s, with a weathered coat and a camera bag slung over his shoulder. His face bore the lines of years in law enforcement, and his eyes, though tired, were sharp with focus. Inside the kitchen, Tony laid out the evidence. The bottle with its white cap, the crumpled wrapper Bentley had dug from the soil, and the tablet recovered near the well. The items looked harmless at a glance, but together they carried a weight that filled the room. Parker adjusted his glasses and began his work. He photographed each object from every angle, his hand steady. He logged details with care, the misaligned print on the label, the powder flecked on the wrapper, the faint crumble of the half-dissolved tablet. His camera clicked in sharp rhythm, each flash capturing another piece of the truth. Bentley watched the process closely, pacing around the table. At one point, he lowered his nose to the jar, holding the tablet, his nostrils flaring. He sneezed sharply, then gave a low bark, as if to confirm what Tony already felt. That something was wrong. "Even the dog knows," Parker muttered half to himself, snapping another photo. Tony handed him the invoice he had found in the attic, the one bearing Kylie's name. Parker studied it, then slipped it into a folder. "Paper trail matches the pattern," he said. "But we'll need more. I'll cross-check suppliers, see who else has ordered from them." They stepped outside to the garden, where Rosa had first fallen to her strange craving. The soil was still disturbed, patches darker where the wrapper had been pulled. Parker knelt and took samples, scooping earth into small plastic bags. Bentley moved alongside him, nose pressed to the ground, tracing the same spots. He circled twice, then stopped by the trellis, pawing at a patch of soil. Parker leaned closer. Buried shallow was another shard of paper smaller than the first. He teased it free with gloved fingers and sealed it into an evidence bag. "Looks like your partner here is earning his keep," he said with a faint smile at Bentley. Tony crouched to pat the shepherd's shoulder. "He always does." By noon, Parker had filled a small case with photo samples and notes. He promised to return once the lab work was done, and the records were traced. As he packed his camera, his eyes met Tony's. "What you've started here, it's bigger than a child's odd behavior. Stay ready. This may cut deeper than you think." Tony nodded, his notebook open in his hand. He added a final line, day 4. Investigator Parker began case. Evidence recorded. Bentley alerted to more signs in the garden. That night, after Rosa had gone to bed, Tony sat at the kitchen table again. The lamp cast a weak glow over the old letters he had carried down from the attic. Dust clung to their folds, but the script of Rosa's grandmother remained clear. The kitchen was hushed, the old clock ticking faintly on the wall. Tony spread the bundle of letters across the table, the ink faded but still legible under the glow of the lamp. His hands lingered over the first page, the script of Teresa Quinn, steady and firm, as if each stroke of her pen had carried weight. He began to read. The words reached across years, carrying warnings that chilled him. "Our family has faced shadows before. When I was a girl, your grandfather fell ill. He craved earth from the fields, just as Rosa does now. We were told it was nerves, nothing serious. But we later learned someone had tampered with his medicine, slipping in clays that poisoned the body and confused the mind. It took us months to uncover the truth." Tony leaned back the paper, trembling slightly in his hand. He had thought Rosa's condition was rare, unexplainable. Now he saw that history was repeating itself, each generation stalked by the same hidden threat. He turned to the next letter. Teresa's writing grew more urgent. "Beware those who stand close but whose hearts are not steady. In times of inheritance, trust can be twisted. Watch over the children, for where there is wealth, there are always hands reaching to control it. I fear what greed can do within our own bloodline." Tony's chest tightened. He remembered the day the court had secured Rosa's trust fund after her mother's passing. The estate had been modest, but her grandparents had left savings set aside for Rosa's future. Kylie had been present at the reading of the will, her smile polite, her hand resting lightly on Rosa's shoulder. At the time, Tony had brushed aside his unease. Now the letter cast that memory in a new light. He opened another envelope. This one carried an invoice the same style as the one he had already found in the attic. The name Kylie Hale appeared again, attached to a past purchase of supplements from a different supplier. The date was from months earlier, long before Rosa had first shown symptoms. Bentley shifted on the rug, his ears twitching as though he too sensed the heaviness of what lay on the table. Tony looked down at him, then back at the stack of papers. The truth was clearer now. Rosa's cravings were not chance, not a passing phase. They were the product of something deliberate, something ordered, and placed within reach by someone inside his own home. Tony wrote quickly in his notebook. Day 4 continued. Letters confirm family history of similar illness caused by tampered medicine. Mention of inheritance disputes. Invoice in Kylie's name matches current pattern. His hand pressed harder with each line, the pen cutting into the paper. The lamp flickered the shadows on the walls, shifting. The farmhouse creaked in the night wind, its beams carrying the memory of generations. Tony sat in the stillness, the letters spread before him like a map of warning. Rosa's soft cough carried from the next room. Tony rose at once, gathering the papers and slipping them into a folder. He pressed the notebook against his chest, the weight of his grandmother-in-law's words now his burden to carry. He stepped quietly into Rosa's room. The girl lay curled under her quilt, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Bentley had already positioned himself at her bedside, his head resting on the floorboards, eyes watchful. He gave a small wag of his tail when Tony entered, but did not move. Tony brushed a strand of hair from Rosa's forehead. The locket glinted faintly under the lamplight, her fingers clutching it even in sleep. He whispered softly, "I will protect you. I swear it." But his words did not ease the fear pressing in his chest. Rosa stirred restlessly, her cheeks flushed, a faint rash beginning to show along her arms. Tony sat on the edge of the bed, the folder of letters heavy in his hand. The truth was out in the open now, but the cost was growing by the hour. Days blurred together inside the farmhouse. Each morning Tony marked the date in his notebook. Each evening he recorded Rosa's symptoms with heavier strokes of his pen. The words grew darker as the girl grew paler. Rosa's once lively eyes had dulled shadows beneath them, deepening. She tired quickly, sometimes too weak to rise from bed. The rash along her arms spread in faint patches, her skin warm to the touch. When she stood, the room seemed to tilt beneath her feet, and she clutched the locket at her chest as though it could steady her. Tony watched helplessly, his jaw set in quiet fury. Kylie's reassurances echoed through his mind. Her calm voice telling him the pills were nothing more than vitamins, her smooth smile urging patience. Yet the letters from Teresa whispered a harsher truth. Danger comes dressed as care, and trust can be twisted by greed. He tried to believe in evidence, to trust the records Parker was gathering, but the sight of Rosa gasping for breath pressed against his resolve. At times, doubt gnawed at him. Was he imagining too much, seeing patterns where there were none? Or was Kylie's calm a mask hiding something deeper? Bentley never wavered. The shepherd stationed himself at Rosa's side both day and night. He lay at the foot of her bed, head between his paws, ears flicking at every sigh that escaped her lips. When Rosa shifted, Bentley rose and followed her. When she trembled, he pressed his body close, his warmth a silent comfort. At dawn, when Tony crept into a room with a mug of water, he found Bentley already there, nose nudging Rosa's hand until she stirred enough to sip. At dusk, when the girl whispered in fevered dreams, Bentley answered with a low whine as though to remind her she was not alone. Tony kept his notes with a soldier's discipline. Day 5. Rosa weaker. Rash spreading, dizzy when standing, appetite poor. Bentley constant presence. Kylie unchanged in explanation, continues to call pills vitamins. Each line steadied him even as the fear pressed harder. One evening, he sat by Rosa's bed while she slept, the lamplight soft on her face. Bentley lay against the door, his body forming a barrier between the girl and the rest of the house. Tony studied the curve of Rosa's fingers around her locket, the same locket her mother had once worn. Grief and suspicion tangled inside him until he felt hollow. The house was quiet but not peaceful. Kylie moved through the halls with her usual grace, but her steps seemed rehearsed, her smile too quick. She spoke of patience, of trusting the doctor, of waiting for time to pass. Tony listened, but said little. His silence was its own decision, his trust bent more toward instinct than her words. Late that night he rose from his chair and opened the window for fresh air. Outside, the field stretched pale under moonlight, the windmill turning with a slow groan. He thought of Teresa's warning, of Parker's words about hidden patterns, of the wrapper Bentley had unearthed from the soil. He looked back at Rosa. Her breathing was shallow, but Bentley's head rested near her quilt, his amber eyes half closed, always watching. Tony whispered into the quiet, "I will not fail you." Yet as the days wore on, the burden grew heavier. Something had to change, some next step had to be taken. It was Kylie who spoke first. She suggested a retreat, a change of air, a house by the lake, where the breeze was clear and the neighbors distant. She said it would ease Rosa's symptoms. She said it would give them peace. Morning light filtered through thin curtains, soft but cold. Tony sat at the kitchen table, notebook open, his pen hovering above a blank page. Rosa was still asleep upstairs, her breathing faint. Bentley sprawled at her side like a silent sentinel. The house was quiet until Kylie entered, silk robe brushing against the floor, her auburn hair gleaming in the light. She poured herself a glass of water, her movements graceful as ever. Then, with a calm smile, she broke the silence. Tony, I've been thinking. This house carries too much weight. The air here is heavy with pollen from the fields, and Rosa's condition has only worsened. We should go to the lake house. The air is cleaner there, the view soothing. She could breathe better, heal better. Tony kept his eyes on his notebook. His hand remained still, though his jaw tightened. He had heard this tone before. The softness, the careful phrasing meant to sound like concern. He closed the notebook slowly, his fingers pressing against its worn cover. The lake house, he asked, his voice measured. Yes, Kylie said, her green eyes bright with conviction. Just for a few days, a retreat. It will give Rosa peace. It will give us all peace. Tony studied her. She appeared sincere, her voice smooth, her smile steady. But the memory of Teresa's letters pulsed in his mind. Beware those who stand close, but whose hearts are not steady. Rosa's cough echoed faintly from upstairs. Bentley barked once a sharp sound, then settled again. The timing drew Tony's eyes toward the ceiling. His daughter was the measure of all things. If the lake house meant exposing her to greater risk, he could not allow it. Yet if refusing too soon gave Kylie reason to tighten her guard, he risked losing the chance to uncover more. He nodded slowly. Fine, we'll go. Relief softened Kylie's features. She touched his arm lightly. You'll see. This is what Rosa needs. When she left the room, Tony opened his notebook again. He wrote quickly, his strokes deliberate. Day 6. Kylie proposed lake house. Reason given? Fresh air. Rosa's symptoms worsening. I will not go blind into this. Parker and the sheriff must be alerted. That evening, after Rosa was asleep and Kylie was upstairs, Tony stepped onto the porch with his phone. The night air was sharp, the field stretching quiet under a pale moon. He dialed Parker's number. She wants us at the lake house, Tony said without preamble. She insists it's for Rosa's health. I don't buy it. I need you ready. Parker's voice came steady through the line. I'll keep my distance. You won't see me, but I'll be there. And I'll loop the sheriff in. If there's anything hidden in that place, we'll have the order to act. Tony closed his eyes briefly, the weight of gratitude and dread mingling in his chest. Thank you. He returned inside, finding Bentley waiting at the door. The shepherd tilted his head, eyes searching Tony's face. Tony crouched, pressing a hand to his fur. We'll need you sharp, boy. Sharper than ever. Bentley gave a soft huff-tail, sweeping once before he padded back upstairs toward Rosa. Tony lingered in the kitchen, staring at the pill bottle on the shelf, its white cap gleaming in the dim light. The storm was building. He could feel it pressing closer with each passing hour. The next morning, the family set out for the lake house. Kylie hummed softly as she packed, her voice light, almost cheerful. Rosa leaned against Bentley in the truck, too weak to speak. Tony drove in silence, his notebook resting on the seat beside him, the folder of letters tucked safely in the glove box. Dark clouds gathered along the horizon, bruised and heavy, promising rain. The road narrowed as the trees thickened, leading them closer to the lake. The air grew damp, the wind sharp as if the storm had been waiting for them. The lake house stood at the edge of the water, its tin roof dulled by years of weather, its wooden siding streaked with age. The trees around it swayed restlessly, their branches bent under the rising wind. As Tony pulled the truck into the gravel drive, the first drops of rain tapped against the windshield. Kylie's voice cut through the low rumble of thunder. It's perfect. Rosa will rest here. She stepped out, her silk scarf snapping in the gust, her eyes scanning the property with practiced ease. Tony glanced at Rosa. She was slumped against Bentley, her face pale, her breath shallow. The shepherd shifted, lowering himself so she could lean on him, as Tony lifted her gently from the seat. Rosa clutched her locket in one hand, her small fingers white with strain. Inside the lake house smelled of damp wood and dust. Candles flickered as Kylie lit them one by one, their flames bending in the draft that slipped under the doors. "See," she said, her voice smooth, peaceful, quiet. But Tony felt none of that. The storm pressed close against the windows, the sky bruised and heavy. The walls seemed to creak with unease, and every shadow stretched too far. He set Rosa on the couch, covering her with a quilt. Bentley lay at her feet instantly, his body tense, his nose twitching at the air. Hours passed, rain hammering the roof, lightning splitting the sky in jagged bursts. Rosa dozed fitfully, coughing now and then, her cheeks flushed with fever. Tony sat nearby, his notebook open, recording each detail. Day 7. Rosa weaker still, breathing shallow, rash spreading, storm heavy. Bentley rose suddenly, his body stiff, ears pricked toward the kitchen. He padded across the creaking floor, nose low, tail rigid. Tony followed, heart quickening. The shepherd stopped by the counter, his muzzle pressed against the cabinet near the sink. He sniffed, then sneezed sharply, pawing at the wood. Tony opened the cabinet. Inside, behind a row of old glass jars, lay a small packet, its edges damp, a faint white powder clinging to the seams. His stomach tightened. He slid it out carefully, his hand trembling. The odor was faint chemical, the same sharp tang he had smelled on the pills. Bentley growled low, his body between Tony and the packet, as if to guard against it. From the living room, Kylie's voice floated in. "What are you doing?" Tony turned the packet, hidden in his palm. "Checking the cupboards. They're damp." His voice stayed even, his expression unreadable. Kylie lingered in the doorway, her eyes flicking briefly toward his hand. Then she smiled lightly, though her voice carried an edge. "Do not trouble yourself. This house has old corners. Dust collects everywhere." She retreated before he could respond, her steps soft against the wood. Tony slipped the packet into an envelope and tucked it deep into his notebook. Bentley pressed close, his amber eyes burning with alertness. "Good work, boy," Tony whispered, scratching behind his ear. When he returned to Rosa, she was awake, her eyes wide and frightened. The storm rattled the windows, rain streaming in sheets. She clutched her locket tightly. "Dad, I dreamed Mom said the storm was coming for us." Tony knelt beside her, his hand steady on hers. "Dreams can't hurt you. I'm here. And Bentley, too." The shepherd leaned against the couch, his body a barrier between Rosa and the rest of the room. Tony's mind raced. The storm outside was fierce, but the greater storm was inside these walls. He had evidence in his hand, Parker waiting in the shadows beyond the road, and Rosa weakening by the hour. A knock sounded against the door, muffled by the roar of rain. Bentley rose at once, fur bristling, his growl sharp and low. Kylie moved quickly, her smile tight. "It's the doctor," she said. "He's here to help Rosa. He'll adjust her medicine." Tony's stomach dropped. Rosa whimpered and clutched the locket to her chest, her eyes wide with fear. Bentley stepped forward, body rigid, teeth bared. The door creaked open with the weight of the storm pressing behind it. A gust of rain-scented wind swept into the room before Kylie ushered in Dr. Harold Pike. His white coat was damp at the shoulders, his hair plastered by the downpour. His eyes, shadowed and weary, darted briefly toward Tony, then away. "Thank you for coming," Kylie said, her tone velvet but edged. She gestured toward Rosa. "She needs her dosage adjusted. The tablets are too weak. Please give her what she needs." Tony stiffened his hand, brushing the notebook hidden inside his jacket. His instincts screamed against every word, yet he held. His silence, his eyes locked on the scene unfolding. Rosa shrank back into the couch, the quilt pulled tight to her chin. Her small hands clutched the locket against her chest, her knuckles pale with effort. Her wide eyes glistened with tears. "Dad," she whispered, voice trembling, "don't let them." Bentley moved first. The shepherd stepped between Rosa and the approaching doctor, his frame rigid hackles raised along his spine. A deep growl rumbled through his chest, low and constant, vibrating in the floorboards. His amber eyes glared at Pike's hands, where a black leather satchel now rested. The doctor hesitated, his fingers fumbling as he pulled out a vial and a syringe. Lightning flared outside, throwing sharp shadows across the walls. He drew liquid into the syringe with shaking hands, the needle catching the light like a shard of glass. "Kylie," Tony said at last, his voice quiet but firm. "What is this?" She did not flinch. Her green eyes were sharp, her voice steady. "It is medicine. You know she is getting worse. You've seen it. If you truly want her well, let him do his job." Tony's jaw tightened. Every instinct told him this was wrong, that Rosa's fear was not misplaced. Yet if he stopped it too soon, Kylie would hide deeper and the truth might slip through his fingers. He clenched his fists, forcing himself still. The storm outside roared louder. Rain pounded against the roof, thunder shaking the windows. Rosa whimpered and pressed her face into Bentley's fur. The shepherd lowered his head, baring his teeth, his growl rising in pitch. Dr. Pike's breath came quick, his forehead damp not from rain, but from nerves. His hands shook as he lifted the syringe, the tip glistening in the candlelight. "Hold her still," he muttered, though his voice cracked with unease. "No," Tony said sharply, rising to his feet. His body blocked the couch, his shoulders squared. "If you're so certain, explain the contents first. What is in that vial?" Kylie stepped closer, her voice cutting. "You are wasting time. Every moment you hesitate, she suffers. Stop playing detective and be a father." Bentley's growl surged into a bark that rattled the room. He pressed forward, teeth bared, his body braced like a wall of muscle and loyalty. His eyes never left the syringe. The tension coiled tighter with every heartbeat. Tony felt it in the air, in the floor, in the storm that battered the house. The syringe hovered inches from Rosa, the girl trembling, clutching her locket as if her mother's spirit might shield her. Tony's hand reached instinctively for his pocket, brushing the folder of evidence he had carried this far. He knew the moment of choice was at hand, the point where truth and danger collided. Outside, another flash of lightning split the sky, followed by a crash of thunder that shook the beams. The storm had broken in full, and so had the fragile balance in the room. Dr. Pike's hand lowered toward Rosa's arm, the syringe trembling, the needle catching the light. Bentley lunged. Bentley launched forward with a roar of muscle and loyalty. His body struck the small table beside the couch, sending it crashing into Dr. Pike's arm. The syringe flew from his grasp, clattering across the floorboards. Vials tumbled, one shattering against the wood. A sharp chemical odor filled the air, stinging Tony's nose and burning his throat. Rosa cried out, curling tighter under the quilt, clutching her locket as though it were a shield. "Control that animal." Kylie shrieked, her calm mask torn away. Her voice cut through the storm's roar, edged with fury. But Tony did not move to restrain the shepherd. He moved to block Kylie instead, his arm pressing her back as she tried to lunge toward Rosa. His eyes burned with a fury long held at bay. "Stay away from her," he said, his voice low, steady, unshakable. Kylie's green eyes flared with rage, her mask slipping completely. "You fool," she hissed. "Do you think you can protect her from everything? Without me, you'd have nothing. Without me, she—" Her words broke off as Bentley snarled again, his teeth bared, standing squarely between Rosa and the chaos. His paws slid through shards of glass, but he did not flinch. His growl was steady thunder beneath the storm outside. "Doctor." Pike staggered back, his hands trembling, his face pale. "I didn't want this," he stammered. "I didn't. She forced me." The door burst open before he could finish. Wind and rain tore through the frame as Parker Mendel stepped in, coat-soaked, camera already raised. Behind him came Deputy Chief Briggs and 2 county officers, their badges glinting in the candlelight. Sheriff's order. Briggs barked, his voice cutting through the storm. "Step away from the child. Nobody move." The room froze. Kylie's face drained of color, her perfect composure shattered. For the first time, her eyes flicked with something raw fear. Parker moved quickly, capturing everything in sharp bursts of light. The shattered vial, the spilled liquid soaking into the floor, the syringe glinting under Bentley's paw, and Kylie's face twisted in anger. Each image sealed the truth into record. Dr. Pike sank into a chair, his shoulders slumping. His satchel slid from his lap, spilling smaller vials and crumpled papers. One rolled across the floor to Parker's feet. The investigator bent, bagging it carefully, his expression grim. "Tony," Parker said without looking up. "We've got what we need." Kylie's voice rose shrill and desperate. "You cannot do this. You have no proof, no right." Briggs silenced her with a cold glance. "We have more than enough. You'll have your say in court." Tony kept his arm pressed firmly against her path, his body unyielding. Rosa whimpered from the couch, her eyes wide, but Tony's gaze never wavered from Kylie's. For the first time, the house felt lighter, as though the storm outside had found its echo inside these walls. Bentley moved to Rosa's side once more, his growl softening into a protective huff. He pressed his head into her lap, urging her to unclench her trembling fingers from the locket. Slowly, Rosa leaned into him, tears streaking her cheeks, but relief shining faintly through. The storm howled against the windows, rain pouring in sheets as though trying to wash the house clean of its secrets. Tony's breath steadied. His daughter was still alive, still clinging to hope. And now the truth was finally within reach. Briggs gestured to his men. "Secure the evidence. Every vial, every wrapper. Seal the satchel." Parker's camera clicked again, capturing Kylie's silent fury. Tony crouched by Rosa, his voice soft. "It's over now. You're safe." But deep down, he knew it was not yet finished. There was still more to uncover, more lies to strip away before Rosa could truly heal. The letters, the invoices, the false labels, they all pointed to a truth that had yet to be spoken aloud. The storm raged on, battering the lake house with wind and rain, but inside the walls, the greater tempest was breaking. Deputy Briggs's men moved with quiet precision, sealing vials into evidence bags, photographing every surface, and collecting the scattered wrappers that glistened damp on the floor. The air was sharp with the smell of chemicals mingling with the wet wood of the house. Dr. Pike sat hunched in a chair, his face pale and drawn, his hands trembling as if the storm had seeped into his bones. At last the words tumbled from his mouth, halting but clear. Kylie, she pressured me, threatened to expose debts I couldn't pay. I altered the prescriptions, relabeled the bottles, signed off what I shouldn't have. I never wanted to harm Rosa, but I was too weak to refuse. Parker's camera clicked as the confession spilled into the air. He leaned closer, voice low but cutting. "And you supplied the white-capped bottles? The invoices match your name." Pike nodded, tears standing in his eyes. "Yes. The pills weren't vitamins. They were laced with clays. Agents that feed cravings confuse the body. Harmless in trace amounts, toxic in steady doses. His words broke his shoulders, sagging under the weight of guilt. Kylie's silence shattered. She stepped forward, her composure stripped, fury twisting her face. "Do not paint me the villain," she spat. "You all benefited from me. Tony most of all. Without me, Rosa's inheritance would drown in bureaucracy. I brought order, stability." Briggs raised a hand, his tone cold. "What you brought was poison, Mrs. Hale. And the law will see it that way." Her mask cracked further. She laughed sharp and bitter, though her eyes burned with panic. "You think you've won? You think dragging me through courts will undo years of survival? You're fools. All of you." Tony's eyes stayed fixed on her, but his arms were already around Rosa. He lifted his daughter gently from the couch, her small frame light against his chest. She nestled into him, clinging to the locket with trembling fingers. The warmth of her trust pressed against his heart like a vow renewed. Bentley walked at his side, his body close, his steps steady despite the glass and debris littering the floor. Each time thunder cracked, the shepherd gave a short huff, as though telling Rosa he was there, that no storm, inside or out, could shake him from her side. Briggs signaled to his officers. Kylie's wrists were bound with cold steel, her protests drowned by the rain that howled through the open door. Parker filmed her face as the cuffs closed, capturing her last mask as it broke into rage and helplessness. Tony stepped into the storm. Rain hammered down, soaking his shirt, plastering Rosa's hair to her forehead. The water poured over them in heavy sheets, but to him it felt like cleansing, as though the heavens themselves were scouring away the poison that had crept into their lives. Rosa stirred weakly, whispering against his shoulders. "Is it over?" Tony pressed his cheek to her damp hair. "Yes, sweetheart. It's over." Behind them, Parker and Briggs carried the satchel of evidence to the waiting car. Pike followed under guard, his head bowed, his voice broken in confession. Kylie was led into the night, her fury swallowed by the roar of the storm. Bentley shook the rain from his coat, then fell into step beside Tony, his amber eyes glinting with fierce loyalty. Each stride he took matched Tony's each step, a reminder of the guardian role he had never abandoned. As they reached the truck, Tony settled Rosa gently into the seat, wrapping her in a dry blanket. He glanced once more at the lake house, its windows glowing faintly against the storm. It looked less like a refuge now, more like a hollow shell stripped of its secrets. The rain poured on unrelenting, but Tony felt a shift inside him. The truth had been dragged into the light, and though the battle was not finished, the path forward had begun. The storm passed, leaving the field soaked and glistening under pale morning light. The lake house, now silent, felt miles behind them. Tony drove back to Cedar Mill with Rosa bundled against his chest and Bentley's steady frame pressed close. The sheriff's cruiser followed, carrying evidence and confessions that would soon face the weight of the law. At home, the farmhouse felt different, still heavy with memory, but touched with a faint hope. The air smelled of damp soil and cut grass, fresher than the lake house, warmer than the storm. Tony laid Rosa gently in her bed and drew the quilt to her chin. Bentley settled at the footboard, his body coiled like a spring ears, alert even in the quiet. The days that followed were slow, marked by patience and vigilance. Rosa still stirred with cravings. At times, she whispered that she needed the earth, her small fingers twitching toward the garden outside. Twice, Tony found her near the window, gazing longingly at the soil after a rain shower. Each time, Bentley was already there, nudging her back, his amber eyes steady, as if to remind her of the danger that clung to those urges. Tony wrote everything down. His notebook grew thicker, page after page filled with careful detail. Day 1 after the raid, Rosa still craves soil, lips dry, rash faint but present. Day 3, cravings weaker, rash receding. Bentley alert, never leaves her side. His handwriting, once steady and broad, grew tighter with fatigue, but he never faltered. He would not let memory blur the truth again. Rosa's strength returned in small steps. She laughed softly when Bentley pawed at the honey jar on the counter, sniffing it as though on duty. She whispered stories into his ear as she clutched her locket, her voice thin but no longer broken. Her cheeks, once pale, began to hold color again, touched by the warmth of the sun that streamed through the windows. Each evening, Tony read aloud at her bedside. His voice carried steady stories, sometimes of her mother's favorite books, sometimes of his own childhood. Bentley lay across the doorway, his body forming a silent barrier. Rosa often fell asleep with her hand buried in his coat, her breathing finally even. The cravings lingered, but each day they weakened. The rash faded, the dizziness dulled. By the end of the second week, Rosa was able to walk to the garden again, not to kneel in the dirt, but to smell the daisies her mother had once planted. She leaned on Tony's arm, Bentley pacing on her other side, his tail brushing her leg with every step. Tony's heart ached at the sight. The garden, once tainted with fear, now bloomed again as a place of healing. He wrote in his notebook with deliberate strokes, Day 14, cravings minimal. Rosa smiled among the daisies. Bentley, constant presence. Signs of recovery strong. Still, he knew this was not the end. Healing the body was only part of the path. Justice had to follow. Rosa's inheritance, her safety, the betrayal that had poisoned their home, all of it would be weighed in court. At night, when Rosa slept soundly at last, Tony sat at the kitchen table with Parker. The investigator laid out the evidence once more. The forged invoices, the altered labels, the satchel of vials. Each piece was logged, catalogued, irrefutable. "The trial is coming," Parker said. "She will answer for it, and so will the doctor. This time they cannot twist the truth." Tony closed his notebook gently, his gaze drifting toward the stairs, where Rosa slept with Bentley curled beside her. "Good," he said quietly. "Because my daughter deserves more than survival. She deserves justice." The farmhouse fell quiet again, but this time it was not the silence of grief. It was the silence before the reckoning. The courthouse in Cedar Mill was a modest brick building, its steps worn by decades of footsteps. Yet on the morning of Kylie's trial, it carried a weight that felt larger than the town itself. Clouds gathered overhead, gray and restless, as if the weather too waited for judgment. Inside, the air was thick with murmurs. Reporters from neighboring counties had come, their pens ready. Neighbors filled the benches, faces solemn, some familiar from the very streets where Tony had walked patrol. He sat at the front, Rosa's hand resting in his Bentley curled at their feet. The shepherd's calm presence drew quiet nods of respect from those who had heard pieces of the story. When Kylie entered, her silk grace had faltered. Her wrists bore the marks of restraint, her smile brittle and hollow. She carried herself with a defiance that wavered under the stares fixed upon her. Judge Whitmore, a man with a stern face framed by years of service, brought the room to silence with the strike of his gavel. "We are here to consider charges of fraud, tampering, and reckless endangerment." His voice carried no flourish, only the weight of truth. The prosecutor laid the evidence in order. Parker's photographs projected across the courtroom showed the altered pill bottles, the misaligned labels, the shards of wrappers dug from the soil. The invoices with Kylie's name blazed across the page, each line linking her to the chain of deceit. Then came Dr. Pike. He walked slowly to the stand, his shoulders bent, his face drawn with shame. Under oath, his voice cracked as he spoke. "She threatened me. She said if I did not alter the prescriptions, she would destroy what little I had left. I relabeled bottles, I signed off shipments. I betrayed my oath as a doctor." Gasps rippled through the room. Pike's confession was plain, undeniable. His tears fell freely, but his words held steady. "I cannot undo the harm I caused, but I can speak the truth now, in full." Kylie's mask shattered. She rose, her voice sharp with desperation. "Lies, all of it. You twist this to make me your villain. I gave Rosa care. I gave this family order." The judge's gavel cut through her protest. Order in the court. Tony did not rise, did not speak. He held Rosa closer, feeling her trembling quiet beneath his arm. Bentley shifted, his warm body pressed to their feet, steady as stone. The trial moved swiftly, the evidence unshakable. By afternoon, the verdict was read. Kylie Hale was found guilty of fraud and endangerment. The sentence would be served under state custody, her influence over Rosa severed permanently. Yet one matter remained: the trust fund Rosa's grandparents had left behind. The judge's tone softened as he spoke. It is the court's decision that the fund be removed from disputed guardianship. It will be overseen by an independent trustee, Sarah given, a retired teacher of this community whose record of fairness and integrity is without question. Heads nodded across the benches. Sarah, a silver-haired woman seated quietly near the front, rose and bowed her head. "I will serve only for Rosa's good," she said firmly. Relief washed over Tony. For the first time in months, he felt a measure of security settle around his daughter's future. Rosa leaned against him, whispering softly, "Is it really done now?" Tony kissed the crown of her head. "Yes, sweetheart. The worst of it is behind us." As they stepped outside into the afternoon air, the gray clouds began to part, streaks of sunlight breaking through. Reporters crowded the steps, neighbors murmured words of support. But Tony saw only his daughter in the light clutching her locket, and Bentley standing tall beside her, the quiet hero of every step. The courthouse doors closed behind them. Ahead lay not more battles, but the work of rebuilding. The farmhouse had stood through decades of seasons, but months of grief had worn it down. Paint peeled from the siding boards, warped from rain, and the fence that once circled the yard sagged in places, its whitewash long faded. Tony had walked past it day after day, his mind too consumed with Rosa's survival to lift a brush or hammer a nail. Then one morning, just days after the trial, he heard the rumble of trucks pulling into the drive. He stepped onto the porch and found neighbors gathered, tools in hand. Mr. Hargrove, bent but spry, carried a bucket of nails. The Ramirez brothers lifted new planks from their truck bed. Mrs. Keller balanced a tray of lemonade on her hip, her smile steady. "We thought it was time," Hargrove said, tipping his hat. "A house heals faster with a good fence and fresh paint." Tony stood silent for a moment, his throat tight. He had worn the badge for years, helped these same people patch roofs after storms, haul hay when the harvest ran late. Now they had come for him. Rosa peeked from behind the screen door, clutching her locket. Bentley stood beside her tail, wagging slowly, his eyes scanning the yard as though approving the gathering. The work began with the rhythm of hammers and saws. Boards were pried loose, and replaced brushes swept long strokes of white across weathered walls. Children from the town darted between ladders, their laughter spilling into the air. Rosa watched shyly at first, then stepped out to hand a brush to one of the younger boys, her smile small but real. Bentley moved among the workers like a foreman. He circled the fence, nose twitching at each fresh plank, tail wagging whenever a nail was driven firm. When Mrs. Keller set down her tray, he parked himself nearby, ensuring no wandering child spilled the lemonade. Neighbors laughed, calling him the silent boss of the project. As the day stretched on, the farmhouse began to glow. The siding brightened under new paint, the fence straightened with sturdy posts. Vines were trimmed daisies, replanted along the path. Tony found himself with a hammer in hand, sweat streaking his brow, his heart lighter with each strike. Rosa sat on the porch steps, Bentley leaning against her shoulder, watching the world reshape itself around them. By evening, lanterns hung along the new fence, their soft light mingling with the scent of fresh paint and cut grass. Neighbors gathered in the yard, sharing food stories and laughter. Hargrove raised a glass. "To healing," he said, his voice rough, "and to the shepherd who stood guard when we could not." All eyes turned to Bentley. The dog, sprawled comfortably in the grass, lifted his head at the sound of his name. His amber eyes gleamed in the lantern light, his ears twitching as if embarrassed by the attention. Rosa leaned forward and kissed the top of his head, whispering, "My hero." Applause rippled through the crowd. Tony looked down at Bentley, then at his daughter's smile, fragile but growing stronger. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe that peace could take root here again. The night settled with laughter echoing through the fields. The farmhouse, once cloaked in shadows, now stood bright and whole, its fence straight and white against the dark. Tony closed his notebook with a final note for the day. Community gathered. Fence restored. Rosa smiled. Bentley honored as silent guardian, but his heart knew the work was not yet done. Rosa's healing needed more than fences and paint. She needed a place where her strength could grow, where her grief could turn into something brighter. The fence gleamed white in the morning sun, and for the first time in months, the farmhouse yard felt like it belonged to the future instead of the past. Tony stood with Rosa in the open space near the back corner of the property, the ground freshly tilled by neighbors the day before. The soil was dark, rich, ready. "This will be ours," Tony said quietly. "Not just for us, but for every child who needs a place to feel whole again." Rosa's small hands clutched a paper packet of seeds. She looked up at her father, her gray-blue eyes brighter than they had been in weeks. "A garden, a therapy garden," Tony confirmed. "For children who are hurting. For kids who need hope. Just like your mother wanted." Rosa knelt in the dirt, her locket swinging against her chest as she opened the packet carefully. Tiny seeds spilled into her palm. She pressed them into the soil one by one, her touch gentle, reverent. Bentley sat close, his amber eyes following each motion. When Rosa leaned forward, the shepherd leaned too, sniffing the ground as if approving every seed she placed. Neighbors began to arrive carrying trays of saplings, buckets of water, and small garden tools. Mrs. Keller brought marigolds, saying they were flowers of courage. The Ramirez brothers carried a young rose bush, its buds just beginning to form. Even Hargrove arrived with bean vines coiled around sticks, grumbling that they needed a proper start. Rosa's hands grew dirty, but her smile widened. She showed the other children how to press soil over the seeds, how to pat it down gently. Bentley walked slowly along the rows, sniffing here and there, occasionally nudging a crooked seedling back into line with his nose. Laughter followed him as the children began to call him the garden guard. Tony watched from the porch steps, his notebook resting on his knee. His pen moved steadily, day. 20 Rosa planting seeds. Her laugh returned. Bentley guarding Rose, community present, garden alive. Each word steadied his heart, each page proof that healing had taken root. By afternoon, the yard had transformed. Rows of daisies, marigolds, and young roses lined the beds. Small paths curved between patches of mint lavender and beans. The air filled with the scent of damp soil and the chatter of children. Rosa moved among them like a quiet leader, her locket catching the sunlight as she explained which seeds needed more water, which plants liked the shade. Bentley never strayed far. He stationed himself at the edge of the garden, ears perked, tail swishing lazily. When a child spilled water on their shoes, he trotted over and licked their hand as if to ease their embarrassment. When Rosa stumbled slightly, he pressed his body against her until she found balance again. As evening fell, lanterns were strung along the fence, their glow casting the new garden in warm light. Rosa stood in the center, her small figure framed by rows of fresh soil and green shoots. She raised her hands, dirt still clinging to her fingers, and whispered, "This is for Mom." Tony felt his throat tighten, but pride steadied him. He looked at his daughter strong despite the shadows she had walked through, and at the dog who had never left her side. Together they had turned pain into something that would bloom. Bentley gave a short bark, breaking the hush. The children laughed and crowded around him, patting his back, calling him their silent guardian. Tony closed his notebook for the night. Tomorrow would bring the garden's opening, a moment of promise not just for Rosa, but for every child who stepped through its gate. The morning of the opening dawned crisp and clear. The stormy weeks behind them, now only memory. The garden glistened with dew, every leaf beaded in silver, every flower lifting toward the sun, as if eager for the day to begin. Neighbors gathered by the new white fence, their voices warm with pride. Children pressed close to the gate baskets of petals in hand, waiting for the ribbon to be cut. Tony stood near the porch, Rosa's hand tucked firmly in his. She wore a simple white dress, the locket shining against her chest. Though her cheeks were still thin from her illness, her eyes carried a steady brightness that reminded him of her mother. "Are you ready?" Tony asked softly. Rosa nodded. She stepped to the front Bentley, padding close beside her tail, swishing like a slow metronome. The murmurs quieted. All eyes turned toward the little girl who had endured so much, now standing tall in her own garden. She unfolded a slip of paper, the handwriting uneven but careful. Her voice wavered at first, then grew steady. "These are my grandmother's words," she said. "She wrote them long ago, but they are for us now." She glanced at the children gathered, then read aloud. "When you are afraid, look to the flowers. Life still blooms. Even after storms, even after loss, the earth remembers how to grow. So must we." The air held stillness as the words carried over the garden. Adults bowed their heads, children clutched petals tighter, and Tony felt his chest ache with a mix of grief and pride. Then, just as Sarah Given stepped forward with a small pair of scissors, Bentley broke the silence. With a playful bark, he darted forward, seized the red ribbon in his teeth, and tugged it free from the posts. The crowd gasped, then burst into laughter. The children shrieked with delight, chasing after him as he paraded in circles, the ribbon trailing like a banner behind him. Rosa doubled over, with giggles clutching her locket as tears of joy spilled down her cheeks. Even the stern Mr. Hargrove let out a wheezy chuckle, shaking his head. "Looks like the Guardian had his own plan," Parker said, snapping a picture as Bentley bounded past, his eyes gleaming with mischief. Eventually, the shepherd slowed, dropping the ribbon at Rosa's feet. She bent down, kissed his head, and tied the ribbon back across the posts. This time, Sarah clipped it neatly, her voice firm. "The garden is open." Cheers rose, petals flew into the air, and the children rushed in, weaving between rows of flowers and herbs. Their laughter rang through the yard brighter than the lanterns that had once lit the night. Tony stood back, watching Rosa kneel among the daisies, guiding younger children to press their palms against the soil to breathe in the scent of mint. Bentley stood watch at the edge of the path, ears alert, tail wagging at every burst of laughter. He looked less like a soldier now and more like a keeper of peace, his role reborn in the rhythm of the garden. Neighbors lingered, sharing food and stories while the sun dipped low and painted the sky in amber. The fence gleamed, the garden thrived, and for the first time in too long, Tony felt the ache of the past soften into something gentler. He wrote his last line in the notebook that evening, day of the garden's opening. Rosa read Teresa's words. Bentley carried the ribbon. Laughter filled the yard. Hope has returned. He closed the book, slid it onto the shelf, and looked at his daughter. Rosa knelt in the fading light, her locket catching the last rays of the sun, Bentley leaning against her side. The storm had passed. Flowers had bloomed. And life, fragile, resilient, beautiful, had taken root again. The story of Tony, Rosa, and Bentley reminds us that healing does not arrive all at once, but step by step, through patience, truth, and the bonds we choose to protect. Out of shadows of betrayal and fear grew the light of resilience. A child who once trembled with cravings found strength again among flowers. A father who carried grief on his shoulders found purpose in defending his daughter's future. And through it all, a loyal German shepherd stood watch, not with words but with quiet presence, courage, and devotion. Bentley's role in their journey is more than that of a pet. He became a guardian, a silent partner who sensed danger when others denied it, and a source of comfort when human strength faltered. German shepherds have long been known for such qualities: intelligence, loyalty, and an instinct to protect those they love. In this story, Bentley embodies what these dogs give: freely unwavering companionship and a reminder that trust once earned is sacred. Beyond the drama of trials and storms lies a message that reaches further than one family's struggle. It is a call to love and respect the animals who share our lives, to see them not only as helpers, but as hearts that feel protect and heal alongside us. Their presence teaches us about responsibility, about kindness, and about the enduring hope that grows when we care for one another, human and animal alike. As Rosa's garden blooms, so too does the message it carries. Life renews itself even after the hardest seasons. And perhaps that is the greatest gift of all. That in the loyalty of a dog, on the laughter of a child, and the strength of a community, we find proof that hope always finds its way back.